Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. My name is Jo, and if you can't tell from my accent, I'm from the UK in London, not Australia or Ireland, as some of the people here have been guessing from my accent. I am a developer advocate, which means that I get to do fun things like talk to all of you and make silly things on the internet to talk about. And some of the things that I've made recently include a virtual reality game based on an XKCD comic. Does anybody remember this one? The Emoji Sports. So I decided to make hedgehog curling, which is the one in the top right-hand corner there. So this is my VR hedgehog curling game on the left, and then on the right is a very important app called Biscuit Tinder, which is a progressive web app that allows you to rate your favorite biscuits. And I also have something to confess. I'm a bit of a notification addict. I love getting that little reminder that someone out in the world is thinking about me. And not only that, but I get kind of anxious, like actual, genuine, like sweaty withdrawal if I'm away from the internet for too long, if I don't have an internet connection. And in fact, visiting the States has been really good for me because not only am I now missing all the tweets in my feed because I'm in the wrong time zone, but also I can't afford the roaming data. So every time I leave the hotel, I'm cut off like cold turkey. But the story that I'm here to tell you about is basically my attempt at enabling my own addiction at a time when I knew when I wouldn't be able to constantly check my phone, my wedding day. So let's begin at the beginning of this story. And our story begins at an EMF camp long, long ago. Now, EMF camp, if you've not heard of it before, for want of a better description, it's like Glastonbury Festival for nerds. So imagine a huge field, a bunch of nerds all bring their tents, they bring their hacking projects with them, to this field in the middle of the UK, and there's electronics, there's computing, there's robotics, there's knitting, you name it, bring it to the camp, hack on it, give talks, party, and it's super fun. And at one of these camps, somebody brought along a giant inflatable bunny rabbit. And when I say giant, I mean this thing was 3 meters tall. And it had some LEDs in it, and it had its own Twitter account. And you could tweet a color to it, and it would change to that color. And I really loved this idea. Changing the way that we interact with tweets really kind of resonated with me. You know, when we tweet, we broadcast a view that we're hoping that people are going to read, that they're going to interact with and respond to. But the inflatable bunny kind of took this idea from the virtual world to the physical world, and it changes the way those interactions happen. I started wondering what it would be like if we could have a thing in our own physical environment that our friends and our loved ones could change just to say that they're thinking about us. No words, no message, no real content, just a change of colors. You could delight or surprise someone from half the world away. And so a scenario kind of like this iconic scene from Sleeping Beauty played out in my head, where two people could be warring to change the color of the rabbit from around the world. And then I thought, what if the LEDs in the rabbit were in something wearable? What if they were in a dress like this? What if they were in my wedding dress? My friends and everyone from around the world will be able to change the color of the dress, and it would be like having their thoughts and well wishes right there with me while I was walking down the aisle. So here began my quest to make a tweetable, light-up wedding dress. But my quest almost instantly hit a brick wall. I was really excited about the idea, but I had genuinely no idea where to start. Now, I studied electronic engineering at uni, which should mean that I know all about this stuff. And I'm a web developer, so using the Twitter API should be a walk in the park. I spend a lot of my time battling this thing called imposter syndrome, which is the idea that everyone around you knows more than you, or that everyone else knows everything, and that one day you're going to slip up and everyone will realize that you don't know what you're doing, that you don't belong, that you're a fraud. Has anyone else ever felt like this? That's a lot of hands. And it's pretty prevalent with people who work in the tech industry. We spend all our time surrounded by these brilliant, intelligent people and we have a tendency to compare ourselves with them and to do so unfavorably. So I was kind of afraid to ask for help because I felt like it would be giving away the fact that I didn't know what I was doing. Not only that, but I also suffer from anxiety related to perfectionism. And this sometimes stops me from getting started on projects. I'm sure a lot of you have felt this as well. It's the idea that you're afraid of getting started on a project in case you mess up, or because you can't pick the exact perfect way to get started. So you just put it off and you procrastinate, and you get this sort of decision paralysis that makes it difficult to even get started. So I found it tough to even get my idea off the ground, and I wasn't sure where to start. I was afraid to ask people directly for help. Incidentally, I would like to make a call back here to both Tilda's talk yesterday and Lara's talk today, and also blame capitalism for many of the problems associated with both imposter syndrome and perfectionism. But back to the story. I knew I needed some lights, and I needed some sort of microcontroller board, and I needed some way to control what color the lights would turn. I'd need some kind of Wi-Fi connection and a battery that is small enough that I could secret it away somewhere on my person. So I did what I always do when I'm stuck, bored, or procrastinating, and I went on Twitter. You may have noticed that I'm a little bit addicted to Twitter, but I needed a starting point or I'd procrastinate forever. So I asked for advice from a general populace, which is much easier than asking a person individually what they would use if they were building such a project. And the advice that I received was kind of amazing. You might actually recognize some of the people in this room from this Twitter stream. A lot of advice. But it was amazing. Like, I cannot thank everyone enough, and I learned a lot. So the first thing that I learned is that there is a board called an Adafruit Feather Hussar, and it measures approximately 5 centimeters by 2 centimeters, and it weighs about 6 grams, which is great. There's hardly anything. That's very easy to sew into a dress. It also has Wi-Fi, which means that I'll be able to get the data from Twitter to the lights. And it has a USB connector, so I'll be able to upload easily from my computer when I've written the code. And I'll also be able to use a USB battery like this to power it. And it costs about $20, which was well within my budget, so I was pretty happy with that. There we go. And I also discovered that Adafruit also make these little individually programmable LEDs. They call them pixels. And they're lightweight and tiny, and they've got little interfaces around the side for sewing in conductive thread, or for soldering if you'd prefer that. And they've also got some really great documentation and a whole load of example code. They also cost about, I think it's about $2 each, or maybe $1.50 each, and I needed about 100 of them for the dress, which was just way out of my budget. So what did I end up actually buying? Well, I bought the Hussar, and then after searching around AliExpress and Amazon and eBay, I found these Chinese knockoff versions of the Adafruit NeoPixels, and they were about $25 for 100, and also the board was white, which was a plus because it was going in a white dress. The solder points on the back are so teeny tiny. I'll show you a close-up of them later. And they don't have any holes for sewing, but honestly, I am really terrible at sewing, so I don't know who I was kidding, thinking I was going to sew these in. I was always going to glue them in. I also bought a soldering iron and all the stuff that goes with it, so some solder, a solder sucker. And as I said, my initial plan, I thought that maybe I would sew the LEDs in, and someone on the Twitter thread had mentioned this stuff called conductive thread, which you can use to connect up the LEDs. But also from the thread, I discovered that actually the impedance of the thread is very high, so if you want 100 LEDs, it's not really the thing to use. And also, if you're going to be moving around in it a lot, the thread isn't great for the connection. And I am a swing dance teacher, so I was going to be moving around a lot in the dress. So I decided to go for the single core copper wire instead, which is really nice and easy to solder because you don't get the frayed ends. And then my plan was to make an underskirt, a nice circle skirt out of this tulle netting, and then to hot glue all the lights into it and to connect them up with the copper wire. So now I had all of the gear, but still very little idea of what actually to do with it. So again, I lent on the community for some help, and I attended a hackathon. And there were loads of lovely people there who helped me to get started, who set me up with the Arduino IDE, and pointed me in the right direction for getting started with working with the lights. So, what did I do? First of all, if you've not seen it before, the thing that you're going to want to use to write code for the Adafruit Feather Hussar is the Arduino IDE. And the IDE comes with a whole bunch of libraries and example code that can get you up and running instantly if this is your first ever project. So you'll need to install the package that will make your code work with the board that you've bought. So in my case, this is the package for the Hussar. And then once you've done that, install the library for the Adafruit NeoPixels from the library manager that comes with the IDE. And the brilliant thing about this is once you've done that, you've got a whole load of just snippets of example code that you can use with the NeoPixels. So for example, it comes with something called the strand test, which is brilliant for testing when you have a string of RGB LEDs. It cycles through every single color so you can make sure that you've connected all your LEDs up correctly. So the next thing that I needed to do was connect up some LEDs. So these are the LEDs that I bought. You can see the back there, there's helpful markings so you can see which one is the power, which one is the data, and which one is the ground. And you need to solder them together like this. So you make sure that they're all pointing in the right direction. Important thing to note here to remember for later, all pointing in the right direction. But they have helpful arrows on them and they're all labeled so you can get them all chained up facing in the right direction. Next, I connected the LEDs up to the board. So the power line is going into the USB pin because I'm using my USB batteries. The data line goes to pin 4 on the board and ground goes to ground. And the final thing to do was to upload my strand test to the board, connect up the battery, and voila, it kind of worked. So now I've got my board set up, I know that the lights are working, but what's next? Well, before I move on to explain what I did next, I want to talk a little bit about what these LEDs are actually doing and how they work. So, what are RGB LEDs? First of all, remember when you were in school and you mixed paints together and you were told that there are 3 primary colors, your red, yellow, and blue, and you might have been given a color mixing chart that looks something like this. So red and yellow is orange, red and blue is purple. These are things that we all know. You mix all 3 of them together and you get this like sludgy, browny black color. So that's paint, but with light it's slightly different. So instead of red and yellow and blue, we have red and green and blue. And they combine like this. So red and blue still make purple, but red and green now make yellow, and green and blue now make cyan. And we combine all of the colors to make white. So why does this matter? Well, the RGB in RGB LED stands for red, green, blue. And inside each LED is a little tiny red, green, and blue light. And because the human eyes aren't that great and the LEDs are actually very close to each other, we see all these colors combined as one. So this is a very, very close up of our little tiny individual pixels. And so we can send a value to each of these 3 lights to tell it how bright to shine, exactly like we would if we were setting a color using RGB in CSS. So we use numbers between 0 and 255, 0 being completely turned off, 255 being completely turned on. And we can give each LED a number between these to create many, many, many different colors. So for example, if I sent color 25500, that would be full brightness in red, no blue and no green. What color would it shine? Red, yeah. And 2550255 would be full on in red, no green, and full on in blue. So what color would that give us? Magenta, yeah. And that's great for us. We've all written CSS. We can understand what is happening here. But I was guessing that most of the people who were coming to my wedding wouldn't know these 3 values. They would want to tweet a color name to my Twitter account. So I needed a way that I could get those color names and then convert them to their RGB values. And the web gives us a whole load of color names. So let's take a look at some of them now. So we've got red, green, and blue. Those are fairly obvious. We've got purple. They start to get a little bit whimsical. So you can have like chocolate or tomato, and then they get quite curious. So peach puff and ghost white, and what else have we got there? Mint cream. So I wanted people to be able to tweet any of these, any of the HTML color names to my Twitter account. And then I would have to get the text of what they sent and convert it. So in order to get the text, the first thing I needed to do was create a Twitter account. Then I needed to write some code that was going to convert the tweets from the HTML color name to the RGB, get that RGB value from the internet to the board, make the board send the right color to the lights, and that should be it. So setting up a Twitter account, fairly self-explanatory. Once that's done, in order to get access to the Twitter API, you go to developer.twitter.com. You can create an app. You have to fill in a whole long form about what your app is and what you're going to do with it. Twitter are really clamping down on developers making Twitter-like experiences these days. So you have to describe what your app is going to do. They don't want you to just show a feed. But once you've filled in the form and it's been accepted, then you have an app, which means that you have an API key, which is what you're going to need when you use the Twitter API. Now, I did this in 2 different ways. Depending on what your favorite language is, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can access the Twitter API. And my original method, I used OAuth and PHP, mostly because I found a video on YouTube that was like, this is how you do it, write this. And I basically just typed out exactly what they said in the video. I shoved it up onto my hosting, and it was great. I could get my Twitter mentions. I could get the mentions at the Twitter account at Joe's Dress. And it was working for about 5 days, and then it wasn't working. And I'm not a sysadmin, and I'm not a back-end developer. And when my code started giving me server errors instead of giving me my Twitter mentions, I had literally no idea what had happened. So I scrapped it all and started again in a language that I do actually know and am more comfortable with, which was JavaScript. So this time I used Node and an NPM package called Twit, which is really great. It gives you a whole bunch of request options for working with the Twitter API. So you can do things like get your whole timeline, or you can just get mentions. You can post a status. You can do a search. And with the search method, I was able to get any text that mentioned at Joe's Dress. If you want to see my code, it's on that glitch link there. I'm not going to walk through it because it's basically just the Twit package with at Joe's Dress in it, and you can look that up in your own time. But if you do want to take a look at it, it's right there. So the first thing that I had to do was take the text from the mentions and search through it for any RGB color values. And there may well be a better way to do this. I'm sure some of you can think of a better way right now, but this is how I did it. I created an array that contained all of the HTML colors that exist, which I got from this link here, htmlcolorcodes.com/colornames, and there are a lot of them. And each color name was the key to a set of 3 numbers, which was the RGB values. I then got the content of the tweet using the Twit package, and I'd loop through this array, checking whether or not it contained any of the keys. So for example, if I got a tweet that said, at Joe's Dress, show me chartreuse, my code would go through and say, okay, does this text contain Alice Blue? No. Does it contain Antique White? No. Does it contain Aqua? No. And we go through and through and through until we get to chartreuse, and it says, yes, the corresponding RGB value is 1272550, and it will return that. I hosted my code up on Heroku, which is currently at this link here. Let's see. Can we actually... Is my mouse on the screen? see if I can actually... Because Heroku, I'm only using the free service, it times out because my dress is polling every 10 seconds, and I've currently got 2 boards in there, so Heroku keeps timing me out. But let's see if it's back up. Hooray! So at the moment it looks like the dress is supposed to be blue, so if I plug it back in now, that we're no longer timed out. Let's see if it eventually turns back to blue. And let's get this back. Okay. So my experience with coding for microcontrollers was basically nothing at the point where I decided to do this dress project. And I took very heavy inspiration, copied and pasted, from the example code that came with the IDE. I knew I needed to connect the board to a Wi-Fi connection. I knew I needed to send a GET request to the Heroku URL that I just put up there. And then I needed to take that RGB value that I got from that GET request and send it to the LEDs. And the Arduino IDE comes with each of these bits of code that I needed. So it comes, if you go to File and Example, there's an example to connect to Wi-Fi, there's an example to send a GET request, and there's an example to send a color to a pixel, which is basically exactly what I needed. And when I was learning front-end development, I learned by copying other people's websites and deleting bits until I worked out what was going on. And so I used the same approach for this project. No need to rewrite code that's already been written. And the Arduino IDE provides us with a monitor that you can print to so that you can do the same kind of thing that you would if you were debugging your JavaScript code with a console log, so you can see what's happening on the board. And as with many projects, it wasn't as smooth sailing as I would have liked it to be. So not only did the failure of my API for reasons unknown happen, but there were a whole bunch of issues that happened just because I didn't really know enough about what I was doing. So first of all, those knockoff pixels that I bought, I was sending my RGB values to them. And when I was telling them to turn blue, they turned green. And when I was telling them to turn green, they turned blue. But when I told them to turn red, they were red. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to work out that these knockoff RGB LEDs weren't RGB LEDs, they were RBG LEDs. Or BRG, yeah, that's the one. So I had to send the numbers in a different order. Turns out those NeoPixels are expensive for a reason. I also discovered when I made Mark II of the dress, and I bought a different type of LED, every time I sent a color to it, every fourth LED was changing to a different color, so it'd be like pink, 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 yellow, pink, 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 yellow. So what is going on here? Turns out you can also get RGBW LEDs that take a fourth value for the brightness. Both of these changes were one character fixes that took me about 2 days each to find. But that was the software written, and the hardware was tested, so now it was time to put it all together. Oh, there we go. And have you heard of the saying, measure twice, cut once? I'm much more of a measure never, cut forever kind of a girl. And I can tell you that that is an incredibly frustrating way to be. Seriously, everyone, if you can, measure twice, cut once. So the first mistake that I made was I assumed that I knew how to make a circle skirt. You know, those beautiful swing skirts that do the swooshing when you twirl. So the theory with them is that you take a piece of fabric, you fold it into quarters, you cut an arc around one edge, and you cut another one in the middle that should be a quarter of your waistline in length. Guess who cut the hole in the middle way too big and had to sew darts into it to make it smaller? The next mistake that I made, I got really overexcited once I'd made the circle skirt, and I hot glued all my LEDs into the fabric because I didn't want the layout of the lights to be too even. I wanted it to sort of look like a starry sky. So I thought it would be fine if I just glued them all in and then connected them up. But guess what I didn't consider? What did I mention earlier? The direction that all the LEDs were facing. Or the fact that each of them needs 3 wires to connect to them, and now they were all random distances apart, so every single distance I had to measure 3 wires and cut them for exactly the right length. Oh. The one lucky break that I had here was that as soon as you hold a soldering iron to the solder points on the back, it melted the hot glue, and I was able to just turn the LED around to face it in the right direction. Yeah, I'm an idiot. So it took about 12 hours of back-breaking, very dull soldering work to get all of the lights connected together. And the other problem with soldering when your lights are already connected into the netting is that a soldering iron goes through netting like a hot knife through butter, or like a soldering iron through butter, you might say. So I burnt so many holes in this thing. It's great that it goes underneath the dress. I discovered since putting this together that you can buy pre-soldered strings of RGB LEDs, and for God's sake, if you're making something like this, buy those. This was the most fiddly, back-breaking thing I've ever done in my life. But it did look really pretty when I plugged it all in and I ran my strand test on it. But then, guess what happened as soon as I tried wearing it and walking around the house? A whole bunch of the solder points instantly snapped, and I had to go back and re-solder the whole thing. And then, after more advice from the internet, hot glued the back of all of the LEDs to give a little bit of strength to those solder points. So the final challenge that I had was putting this skirt into my actual wedding dress, and that involved sewing, which I hate. So the dress had lots of layers of netting and a satin underskirt, and I wanted the LED to sit on top of the satin underskirt, but under the layers of netting, so that I got a nice dispersed effect from the LEDs. If I was able to sew properly, I'd have done a beautiful job of this. Instead, I just did tacking stitch all the way around the top and assumed that no one is ever going to look. And finally, I needed a way, first of all, I needed somewhere to hide the battery. And secondly, I needed a way for the battery to get from basically my underwear to the dress, which is on top now of the satin underskirt. So I bought these stunningly beautiful white cycling shorts, which, who knew they made white cycling shorts, which have a nice little pocket in them so I could keep the LED in and keep the battery in there. And I had to cut a hole into my dress. And when you've just spent hundreds of dollars on a dress, cutting a hole into it is terrifying. So yeah, that's me with the shorts. If I was, again, able to sew, I'd have done a beautiful buttonhole stitch around the hole. I can't, so I just dropped a load of super glue on it, and it was ready to go. And this is the only picture/GIF that I have of it, because guess what? I got into the taxi on the way to the wedding, and one of the solder points snapped, and no one ever saw it. But, oh, thank you, everybody. But the thing is that it didn't really matter, because I learned a load of stuff, and I made a thing that I was really proud of. And I was able to take it home and iterate on it, and take all the stuff that I'd learned and make it better. I say better, this isn't working. So when you embark on a new project, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to do things that occasionally make people raise an eyebrow, but that's okay. If that's the way you work, allow yourself to make mistakes, and then you're going to learn how to do it better. You're never going to get it exactly right the first time round. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the phrase, perfect is the enemy of great. If you're aiming for perfection, you cannot help but set yourself up to fail. Most people don't achieve perfection, and they certainly don't achieve it the first time round. If you're aiming for that, you're never going to actually achieve because you'll never reach it. Just start, just make something, and you'll end up with something great. If you need to try things out and see what happens, do that. If you need to plan everything out before you get started, and plan everything to the last detail, then let yourself do that. Find the way that you work best and understand it and allow yourself to work in that way. When I try and force myself to like plan and measure everything, I just spend forever procrastinating because I hate that. I like to just dive in with the scissors and see what happens. And one of the things that I've learned is that even though asking for help feels really embarrassing and it feels like you're admitting that you don't know something, asking for help is a brilliant way not only to learn what you're doing, but also to meet awesome members of our community. If I hadn't put that original tweet out, I'd have never met Stephanie, who is now a really lovely friend and also completely and utterly saved my ass at least twice a day. Once by lending me a soldering iron, and secondly by setting me up with a hotspot. So I would like to just give her a little tiny round of applause. Thank you. And our tech community is full of so many really lovely people who are willing to help. And, you know, also some opinionated people who just like the sound of their own voices. But don't be afraid to reach out to people. The worst that they'll do is that they tell you that they don't have time to help you. And the best that they'll do is help you or point you towards somebody else who can help you. And if you do have expertise of your own, please offer help to others. Attend hackathons, work with beginners, try mentoring or attending a code club, and even just answering questions on Twitter is just so brilliant and helpful. And I would never have made this non-working dress if Stephanie hadn't answered my questions on Twitter. And if you're not an expert, getting involved in helping people out with their projects is also a really brilliant way to learn stuff. So thank you so much for coming and listening to me. I think I have time for questions? Yeah, loads of time. Excellent. Does anyone have any questions? Green t-shirt? So my next project, which I have actually already agreed to give a talk on and haven't built yet, is a Christmas jumper. So I have to get it done before Christmas. I've got a million different ideas for what I'm going to do. I went to see Katy Perry live recently, and she had a LED display bra, basically, that was showing the lyrics to all of her songs. And I was thinking, like, I could have, like, ho, ho, ho going across my chest. I don't know. We'll see what happens there. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thinking back on it, what would you have done differently to your dress?
So the LEDs that I've actually got in here are Mark II and Mark III of the dress, because Mark I died a death. The one where I soldered it all individually, like, not that. So I then discovered, I don't know if you can see them from here, these ribbon LEDs. They come on a strip. They're great, but quite temperamental. They, for some reason, switch off after a certain amount of time. I don't really know what's going on there. So then I tried Mark III, which is these ones, which I thought might be a little hardier. They're also a bit larger, so they're a bit brighter. But it turns out that because the solder points are going up into the board like that and it's wearable, you get a lot of work hardening and they snap really badly. So now I've discovered you can get ones like this that have a plastic coating over them. They're meant to be waterproof outdoor lights, which I originally didn't go with because I thought they'd be too heavy for a dress. But with more netting, I reckon you can lift them up. Or with more netting, you would just disperse the light better. So that's Mark IV of the dress. The other thing that I would like to do is maybe try a different kind of battery, because these just don't last very long. I've heard lithium-ion batteries may be better, but also the folding, exploding problem for wearables. So I don't know, we'll see what happens there. More planning, I guess. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Here in the United States, there seems to be, and I only know about this because my son logged into the
Oh, really?
And do you know anything about that? And not really, because to me that goes coincides with this, because what they do is they put the LEDs to music, so it goes instead of Twitter, it goes off.
Yeah. I don't know anything about those, but I have seen them before, like in T-shirts and things. So you can basically have your sound bars as the music is playing. Like that would be super fun to play with, and you'd need some sort of microphone in your clothing so that they could hear the music, or yeah, something like that. Yeah, they would be really fun to play with. That was, for people who didn't hear it, have you heard of LEDs that react to music? Yeah.
I have a quick question. Like, how did it feel going through some of the stuff that it's like a domain is like super different and unknown, and it seems like a lot of work. So I'm just curious, like, how are you feeling? Do you feel like you want to keep going?
It was a lot of work, and honestly, it was about a year. So if you look at the date of that first tweet where I was like, I've got this harebrained idea. Sorry, the question was like, basically, I guess, how did I keep going through being an idiot? Yeah, it took me about a year. So I sat on the idea after I did that original tweet. I sat there going like, oh, maybe, I could do this and I could do that. And then the date started getting closer, and I was like, oh, okay, you have to actually build something now if you're going to do this. Plus, I was trying to keep it a secret from my husband. And I managed to solder that whole thing together in the kitchen for 12 hours without him noticing. Which goes to show how observant he is. But I guess it's another case of the whole, like, once you get started, you're kind of invested in it. So you're like, well, I've spent the money on the LEDs now, and I've started this stupid project. I may as well get it out there. Plus, my notification addiction kind of drives me to make stupid things so that more people click like on them. I guess, yeah, like, just keep going, because otherwise you don't have anything at the end of it. There's one at the back. Yes, I did. And I'm not sure. It could be because I don't have the Arduino IDE on this computer. I can't check what's going on the board at the moment. So it could be that my Wi-Fi is down. It could be that my power for some reason isn't working. It could be that the LEDs are shorted. It could be a whole load of different things that are stopping it from working at the moment. And I have a bit of a curse with this dress and demos. It was literally working an hour ago in my hotel room. It's just one of those things where you're like, oh, come on. But yes, I did. The tweets were working. At Joe's Dress is the Twitter account. I will try and get it working again, and like maybe have it out in the hallway or something, and you can come and tweet at it. Yeah.
Where do you find inspiration for your ideas?
From Stephanie. I really like rainbows and sparkly things. So for me, more rainbows and more sparkly things is always better. So that's quite a driving passion for me. And I saw Stephanie show her umbrella and cascade dress at a talk a while ago, and just was like, oh, you can wear rainbows and sparkly things. And, that was it for me. Now I want everything to be lighting up. Okay, shall we call it? Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.